You ever watch someone dial 911 on you for standing in your own driveway? That was the first thing that crossed my mind when the red and blue lights washed over my garage door at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning and made the old brass tools hanging on my father's pegboard flash like tiny warning lights. The air still smelled like fresh coffee, hot motor oil, and the faint dusty cedar smell that had lived in that garage longer than I had. My black F-150 sat sideways across my own concrete drive, tailgate down, a stack of cardboard boxes riding in the bed, and I was halfway through sorting my father's old workbench when I heard heels clicking fast over pavement. I turned, rag in one hand, socket wrench in the other, and there she was, Lindsay Harlow, storming across the curb in white capri pants, oversized sunglasses, and that stiff blonde hair that never seemed to move even when the wind did. She had her phone in one hand and a clipboard tucked under the other arm, like she was reporting to some invisible queen. "I told dispatch you were obstructing access," she snapped, pointing one pale pink fingernail at my truck as if she had just caught me dumping hazardous waste into the street instead of unloading family junk from my own garage. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you. You people." That landed exactly the way she meant it to. I looked past her to the patrol unit easing up to the curb, tires crunching lightly against the gravel edge by the mailbox, and I could already feel the whole morning tightening around me. The officers stepped out calm, hands free, scanning the scene the way good cops do when they know the caller is emotional, but the facts may not be. Lindsay straightened the second she saw the uniforms. Her whole posture changed. She got taller somehow, smugger, like she had just ordered room service and her breakfast had arrived right on time. "Officer," she called before either of them could speak. "This man is blocking emergency access and refusing to comply. I told him this community has standards." The smell of her perfume reached me before her words did, sharp and floral and expensive in a way that never smelled warm. I set the wrench down on the tailgate and wiped my hands slowly on the rag. I didn't rush. I didn't argue. I didn't do what she wanted, which was lose my temper so she could point at that, too. Behind me, through the open garage, I could see my father's old AM radio on the shelf by the vise, silent now, a thin layer of dust on the dial. The same radio he used to turn on every Saturday while teaching me how to rotate tires, gap a spark plug, measure twice before cutting once. This driveway wasn't just a strip of concrete. It was the place where I learned patience from a man who never raised his voice unless a storm was coming. "Ma'am," one of the officers said gently, "let us talk to him." But Lindsay wasn't interested in letting anyone talk. She was interested in performing. "He moved in and immediately started turning this place into a mess," she said, waving toward the open garage. "Boxes everywhere, truck blocking the drive, suspicious people coming and going." I told him HOA rules are clear. Suspicious people. She meant the contractor who had dropped off shelves the day before. She meant the city sedan that had rolled by last week. She meant anything she didn't recognize and couldn't control. I glanced at the edge of the driveway where the property line met the grass, then at the crack in the concrete I used to hop over as a kid like it was some canyon. She had planted herself 6 inches onto my side of it without even noticing. That told me everything. People like Lindsay never studied boundaries because they assumed the world was one long extension of their authority. One of the officers gave me a polite nod. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on this morning?" The easy answer would have been simple. I'm unloading my own truck. On my own property. The harder truth was sitting right beneath that, quiet and loaded. Because Lindsay thought she had called law enforcement to remove a problem from her street. What she didn't know, not yet, was that she had just invited my world onto my driveway, and before this was over, every lie she had poured into that 911 call was going to come back with my name on it. The older officer looked from Lindsay to me and waited, the way seasoned cops do when they already know the loudest person is usually not the most reliable one. I set the rag on the tailgate and finally answered in the calmest voice I had. "I am unloading my truck in my own driveway, officer. That is all." Lindsay let out this sharp little laugh like I had confirmed her whole case. "That is not all," she cut in. "He has been doing this for days. He is making the property look terrible, and I told him this community does not allow this kind of behavior." Community. Behavior. She wrapped ordinary words in that syrupy tone people use when they are trying to make control sound like concern. I could feel the morning sun warming the back of my neck, and for a second I was not looking at Lindsay anymore. I was looking through her, past the patrol car, past the maple tree by the curb, back to another morning on that same driveway 20 years earlier when my father had handed me a socket set and told me a man learns more on concrete than he ever will in a fancy office. My name is Ethan Cole Mercer, and I did not move into that house because I wanted a fresh start in the suburbs or because I needed some perfect postcard life with trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes. I moved back because my father was gone, and that house was the only place in the world that still smelled like him when the sun hit the garage just after dawn. Cedar, cold steel, old paper, a trace of gasoline baked into the floor from jobs done right and jobs redone until they were right. He had left me the place clean, paid off, and stubbornly ordinary, the kind of house people overlook until they start thinking they can tell you what to do with it. 3 weeks earlier, when I first pulled my truck into that drive with boxes strapped down and a framed photograph of my parents wrapped in a blanket on the passenger seat, Lindsay Harlow had materialized before I even killed the engine. She had introduced herself with a smile that never reached her eyes and welcomed me to the neighborhood by handing me a printed sheet of Homeowners Association reminders as if she were presenting federal law. She pointed out acceptable trash can hours, approved exterior paint colors, lawn height, expectations, and some line about preserving the visual harmony of the street. I remember nodding, not because I agreed with her tone, but because I had spent enough years in public service to recognize someone who confused access with authority. I had thanked her, carried my boxes inside, and figured that would be the end of it. It was not. She noticed everything after that. The work light I kept on in the garage after sunset. The contractor who dropped off shelving. The stack of flattened boxes by my recycle bin. The fact that my truck was sometimes parked in the drive instead of inside the garage while I sorted through my father's tools and old fishing gear and military keepsakes. None of it violated a rule that mattered, but that never stopped Lindsay. She had the kind of mind that could turn inconvenience into accusation in less than a heartbeat. Standing there that morning, listening to her build a case out of cardboard and concrete, I understood something simple. She was not upset about my truck. She was upset that something on this street existed without asking permission from her first. The younger officer glanced at the open garage and asked, "Are you moving in or moving out, sir?" "Neither," I said. "I am finally getting around to unpacking a life." That line slipped out before I could stop it, and for the first time one of the officers looked at me like he saw an actual person instead of a call number on a screen. Lindsay rolled her eyes so hard I could almost hear it. "That is very poetic," she said. "But he is still obstructing access." I followed her finger toward my truck, then back to the wide open street behind it, empty except for the patrol unit and her white sport utility vehicle angled half across the curb like rules were only sacred when other people broke them. The older officer noticed it too. I could tell by the tiny shift in his expression. And that was when I knew this morning had started changing, inch by inch, in ways Lindsay had not noticed yet. The older officer took one slow step back and looked at Lindsay's sport utility vehicle, its front tire pressed over the gutter line, and its rear end sticking far enough into the street that a delivery van would have had to ease around it. He did not say anything right away. That was what I appreciated about professionals. They noticed first. They spoke second. Lindsay, on the other hand, rushed to fill every inch of silence like she was afraid the truth might slip in if she left any room for it. "He has been hostile since the day he moved in," she said, tightening her grip on that clipboard. "I welcomed him. I explained the community standards, and he made it clear he was not interested in cooperating." Cooperative. That was another one of her favorite words. It sounded harmless until you realized she used it to describe obedience. I leaned one hand on the tailgate and let the metal cool against my palm. The younger officer glanced at the boxes in my truck bed, then at the open garage, where old fishing rods leaned in one corner and my father's red metal toolbox sat under the workbench exactly where he had left it. "How long have you lived here, sir?" he asked. "I grew up here," I said. "Moved back in a few weeks ago after my father passed." Something changed in his face at that. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. The quiet recognition one man gives another when a place is not just a place anymore. Lindsay did not miss a beat. "And we are all very sorry for his loss," she said in that polished, breathy voice that somehow made grief sound like a line item on a form. But personal hardship does not exempt anyone from neighborhood regulations. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her. She had a way of turning even condolences into enforcement language. The older officer finally spoke. "Ma'am, your vehicle is creating more of an obstruction than his truck right now." Her mouth opened, then closed. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the first hairline crack run through that perfect shell of certainty. She turned to look at her vehicle like she had never seen it before. "I only parked there because this situation was urgent," she said. Urgent. The word hung in the warm morning air between the smell of coffee from my kitchen window and the faint sweet cut grass scent rolling over from the Petersons' yard across the street. Nothing about that moment was urgent. No ambulance. No blocked road. No down power line. No emergency crew. Just one woman with a clipboard trying to weaponize a phone call because a man she could not control had parked a truck on his own property. The younger officer cleared his throat and asked me whether I had identification. I did. Of course I did. I reached for my wallet slowly, careful, familiar, automatic. Some habits never leave you, no matter how many years you carry them. I handed him my driver's license and watched his eyes flick from the card to my face and back again. He did not react. Not outwardly. Good training. Still, I saw that microscopic pause. Most people would have missed it. Lindsay definitely did. She was too busy reassembling her confidence. "I also need to file a formal complaint with the association," she said, already scribbling something on her clipboard. "This sort of disregard cannot become a pattern on our street." Pattern. There was that word again, and the thing she did not realize was that she was right. There was a pattern here, just not mine. Because while she was busy writing down my address and pretending to document community decay, I was starting to remember all the little things from the last 3 weeks that had not sat right with me. The note tucked under my windshield wiper about proper vehicle placement, even though my truck had been fully inside the drive. The photograph she took of my garage from the sidewalk while I was carrying in a storage bin. The way she had stopped my shelving contractor and asked if he was licensed to work in the neighborhood. The fact that Mrs. Bell next door had gone suddenly quiet the first time Lindsay's name came up, then changed the subject so fast it felt rehearsed. Standing there in the morning light, with the officers calm and Lindsay performing outrage like she was on a stage, I stopped seeing isolated annoyances. I started seeing repetition. Habit. A system she had built around herself from complaint forms, selective rules, and the confidence that nobody would ever challenge the way she used them. The older officer handed my license back and said, "At this point, I do not see a criminal issue. This appears to be a neighborhood dispute." Lindsay's jaw tightened. She did not like that at all. She wanted a scene, a citation, a public little victory she could carry house to house with her coffee. What she got instead was uncertainty, and for someone like Lindsay, uncertainty was intolerable. She took one step closer to me, heels clicking on the concrete my father had poured with his own hands 30 years earlier, and lowered her voice like she was offering a final warning. "This is not over," she said. I believed her, not because she sounded powerful, but because I could hear something else underneath it. Panic. She had expected the uniforms to become an extension of her will, and when they did not, something colder slipped through. I looked past her to the garage, to the old radio on the shelf, to the workbench scattered with papers I had not sorted yet, and I had the strangest feeling that this whole ridiculous morning had just done me a favor. Because the moment Lindsay Harlow called the police over my own driveway, she had stopped being a nuisance and started becoming evidence. The patrol cars rolled away without sirens, just a slow crawl down the street under the shade of the maples, and for a few seconds the neighborhood went so still I could hear the loose chain on my father's old porch swing tapping softly against the frame. Lindsay stood at the edge of my driveway like she had been left behind by her own performance. Her sunglasses were still on, but I could tell from the angle of her chin that she was recalculating, searching for some version of this morning that still ended with her in control. She lifted the clipboard, wrote something fast and hard, then looked up at me with that brittle smile people use when they want to pretend a setback was part of the plan. "This is exactly why communities need standards," she said. "Some people only respond when things become official." I did not answer right away. I bent down, picked up the rag from the tailgate, and wiped a streak of grease from my knuckles while the smell of sun-warmed concrete rose around us. The officers were gone. The audience was gone. All that remained was the truth of the moment, and Lindsay did not know what to do in moments where truth was the only thing left standing. You called 911 over a pickup truck in a private driveway, I said. That is what became official. Her jaw moved once, a small sideways tighten, and then she gave me a shrug that was supposed to look elegant and dismissive. Emergency services agreed to respond, she said. That tells me everything I need to know. No, I thought, it tells me everything I need to know. Because people like Lindsay loved the fact of response. They did not care what happened after. They treated a police car like a stamp of moral approval, as if dispatch had sent them not because someone called, but because heaven itself had reviewed the case and selected a side. She stepped backward onto the sidewalk, turned on one heel, and made a show of checking her phone. I watched her fingers move, quick and practiced. Email. Complaint form. Maybe the neighborhood message board. She was already rewriting the morning while it was still warm. I knew the type. By noon, she would have a version where she acted responsibly, where officers had shared her concern, where I had been difficult and defensive and just one step from real trouble. That was how soft power worked in places like this. It did not need facts. It just needed repetition and a willing audience. I spent another hour in the garage after she left, but I did not get much done. I opened one box full of old manuals and my father's tax folders, found a cracked flashlight and a stack of receipts held together by a rusted binder clip, then closed it again. My hands were moving, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept replaying the call in my head, not the words exactly, but the rhythm of it. The certainty. The way Lindsay had spoken before the officers arrived, already convinced that uniforms were just the next step in her personal chain of command. By late morning the heat started to build. Sunlight pushed deeper into the garage and turned the chrome edges of my father's tools bright enough to sting my eyes. I went inside, poured a second cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the window cracked open. That was when I heard the soft scrape of paper against my front door. I stepped outside and found a white envelope tucked under the mat. No stamp, no address, just my name written in neat block letters. That looked carefully impersonal. Inside was a printed notice from the Homeowners Association, complete with logo, lot number, and a bold line that read courtesy warning. According to the notice, I had created an ongoing visual nuisance, interfered with community access expectations, and failed to maintain my property in accordance with neighborhood appearance standards. There was a photograph attached. My truck. My open garage. The boxes in the bed. A timestamp in the lower corner from less than an hour earlier. I stared at it long enough to feel the coffee go bitter in my mouth. She had not just called the police. She had documented me before, during, and after. She had built herself a little paper trail, convinced that volume could substitute for legitimacy. Then I noticed something else in the photo. On the far left edge, barely visible near the strip of grass by the driveway, was the pointed toe of one white heel. Lindsay had been standing inside my property line when she took it. Not by much. Maybe a foot. Maybe less. But enough. I carried the notice into the garage, laid it on my father's workbench, and set it beside the rag, the socket wrench, and the old survey tube I had not opened yet from the stack of house records he kept under the bench. The cardboard smelled dry and old when I pulled the cap loose. Inside were rolled plats, utility sketches, permit copies. All the boring paper most people throw away until the day boring paper becomes the only thing that matters. I spread the first survey across the scarred wood surface, flattened the corners with a box of screws, and traced the line of the lot with one fingertip. Then I looked back at the photo, back at the line, back at the photo again. And for the first time since Lindsay Harlow marched into my morning with a phone in her hand and authority in her voice, I felt something settle clean and cold in the center of my chest. She thought she was building a file on me. She had no idea she had just handed me the first page of one on her. That afternoon turned the whole house into a kind of evidence locker in my mind. The kitchen still smelled like reheated coffee. The garage still carried that mix of cedar dust and old engine oil. And the courtesy warning from the Homeowners Association sat on my father's workbench like it had every right to be there. I read it 3 times, not because it was complicated, but because people like Lindsay always gave themselves away in repetition. Visual nuisance. Community access expectations. Ongoing concern. The language was polished, almost corporate, but underneath it I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me in those white heels again, talking about standards like she owned the air between the houses. I laid the notice flat beside the old property survey and lined up the photograph with the drawn boundary markers. My father had kept records the way some men keep trophies. Neat tubes, labeled folders, copies of permits from 20 years back, even handwritten notes about where the original concrete apron ended and the widened section began when he had poured the extra strip for a utility trailer. It was all boring until it was not. I traced the lot line again and measured the angle of the photo with my eyes. Lindsay had crossed onto private property to document a violation that did not exist. That alone would have been enough to irritate me. What changed the shape of the day was realizing she had done it confidently, like no line on earth applied to her if she was carrying a clipboard. Around 3 o'clock, the doorbell camera chimed on my phone. I checked the feed and saw Lindsay again, this time standing at the curb with Mrs. Bell from next door. Nora Bell was in her late 60s, silver hair always pinned back, the kind of neighbor who watered her flowers before sunrise and never spoke badly about anyone unless she had already run out of other options. Lindsay was angled toward her, doing all the talking. I could not hear the words from the live preview, but I did not need to. Mrs. Bell's expression told me enough. Tight smile, folded arms, the polite look of someone enduring a speech she had heard too many times. By the time I stepped onto the porch, Lindsay had already drifted away toward the next house, still carrying her clipboard like a badge she had printed for herself. Mrs. Bell lingered by my mailbox. "I hope your morning settled down," she said softly. "It did not," I said, and that earned the faintest smile I had seen from her yet. She glanced down the street to make sure Lindsay was out of earshot, then lowered her voice. She does this when someone does not respond the way she expects. I leaned against the porch post and let that sit for a second. "How long has that been happening?" Mrs. Bell looked at the hydrangeas along my walk instead of at me. "Long enough that most people just give her what she wants." There it was. Not a neighborhood. A weather pattern. Not one bad morning. A system. She told me about a young couple 2 houses down who got letters over a basketball hoop their children only used on weekends. She told me about a retired mechanic who left after months of notices about a work van he parked legally in his own drive. She told me Lindsay liked paper because paper scared people. Most folks saw official formatting and started apologizing before they even knew whether they had done anything wrong. When she left, she touched the envelope from the Homeowners Association still in my hand and said, "Keep everything." Those 2 words followed me back into the garage. Keep everything. I opened a drawer in the workbench and found my father's old legal pad, the yellow paper brittle at the corners. I wrote the date, then the time of the 911 response, then the notice, then Mrs. Bell's comments, as close to exact as memory would allow. Once I started, I could not stop. I wrote down the note that had been left under my windshield the week before, the photo Lindsay took from the sidewalk, the way she had questioned the contractor, the way she used phrases like community concern when what she meant was personal irritation. By early evening, I had 2 full pages, and the strange thing was how calm I felt as the list grew. Not angry, not rattled, focused. Because a bad neighbor is one thing. A documented pattern is another. The sun dropped low enough to throw long amber bars across the garage floor, and when I looked up, the old brass tools on the pegboard were glowing again the same way they had when the patrol lights flashed that morning. I stood there in that quiet gold light, listening to a distant lawn mower and the hum of someone's air conditioner kicking on across the street, and I made a decision. I was not going to argue with Lindsay house to house like she wanted. I was not going to raise my voice at the curb and hand her the kind of scene she could package into another complaint. I was going to let her keep talking, keep writing, keep crossing lines she did not even bother to see. And the next time she came onto my driveway acting like she had authority over my name, my property, and my morning, I was going to be ready for a lot more than a clipboard. The next 3 days taught me more about Lindsay Harlow than the first 3 weeks ever had. Once she sensed I was not going to fold, she stopped pretending this was about appearances and started testing how much pressure she could apply before I pushed back in public. It began early Thursday morning with another envelope at my door, this one heavier, stapled, and worded with even more theatrical concern. According to the Homeowners Association, I was now under review for repeated noncompliance related to temporary storage visibility, improper vehicle positioning, and failure to maintain harmony with neighboring lots. Harmony. I stood in my kitchen reading that word while the coffee maker hissed behind me, and the sunrise turned the backyard fence pale gold through the window over the sink. Harmony was a funny thing to accuse a man of violating while you were manufacturing conflict one notice at a time. I carried the letter out to the garage, laid it beside the first one, and added another entry to my yellow legal pad. Date, time, delivery method, language used. I wrote everything down. By noon, Lindsay escalated again. I had scheduled a handyman named Oscar to install 2 sets of wall shelves in the garage so I could finally get my father's boxes off the floor and sort them properly. Oscar arrived in a faded blue van with a ladder strapped to the top and a tape measure clipped to his belt. He had barely stepped onto the driveway when Lindsay appeared from nowhere, moving fast, sunglasses on, clipboard already tucked under one arm like a holstered weapon. I watched from inside the garage as she intercepted him at the edge of the concrete and asked if he was authorized to perform exterior work in the community. Exterior work. The man was carrying shelf brackets into my garage. Oscar looked confused, then annoyed, then tired in that particular way working people get when they realize a simple job has just been dragged into somebody else's personal drama. I walked out before he had to answer for himself. He is with me, I said. Lindsay turned toward me with a smile, so polished it looked painful. That may be, Ethan, but vendors are expected to follow association procedure. There was something about the way she said my first name that made it sound like a warning label. I kept my voice even. He is installing shelves inside my garage. She tapped her clipboard with one fingernail. And your garage has been visible from the street for several days now, which is part of the problem. I looked at the open garage, the boxes, the workbench, the radio, the same ordinary mess of a man rebuilding order after a funeral, and I realized Lindsay did not just dislike disorder. She disliked evidence of a life she had not approved. Oscar shifted his weight and quietly asked whether I still wanted the shelves installed. Yes, I said. Please go ahead. Lindsay stepped half a foot farther onto the drive, enough to make the movement feel deliberate. Then I will have to note that you were informed. Oscar looked at me, waiting. I gave him a small nod and he walked past her into the garage with the brackets in hand. Lindsay did not follow, but she stayed long enough to take 2 more photographs with her phone, careful, centered, deliberate. She wanted me to see her doing it. I made sure my doorbell camera saw it too. That evening, the neighborhood message board lit up. I did not belong to it, but Mrs. Bell took screenshots and slipped them under my door before sunset with a sticky note that said, "Thought you should have these." Lindsay had posted a vague warning to residents about preserving standards during transitions and occupancy. A few people replied with supportive little comments about protecting property values. Others asked what exactly had happened. Then, buried halfway down the thread, someone wrote, "Maybe we should leave the man alone." That comment vanished by morning, deleted, or removed, or quietly pressured into disappearing. I saved the screenshots anyway. By Friday, a plastic orange notice appeared staked into the strip of grass near my mailbox, claiming a pending inspection. It looked official from a distance, which I suspected was the point. Up close, the wording was sloppy and the formatting was off. Not city issued. Association made. Theater, again. I pulled it from the ground, photographed where it had been placed, and added another note to the pad. The thing about repeated intimidation is that eventually it becomes predictable, and predictability is a gift if you know how to use it. By then I did. I stopped seeing isolated annoyances. I started seeing timing, method, intent. Morning notice. Midday confrontation. Evening rumor. Visual markers placed where neighbors could see them. She was building social pressure around paperwork, trying to make me feel watched from all directions. But on Friday night, as the cicadas buzzed beyond the backyard and the garage light cast a clean yellow rectangle across the driveway, I sat at my father's workbench with the survey, the letters, the screenshots, and my legal pad spread in front of me, and a different thought took hold. Lindsay was working far too hard for a man she thought she had already cornered. Which meant one thing. Somewhere underneath the perfume, the printed notices, and that perfectly rehearsed voice, she was afraid I might be exactly the kind of person who knew what to do with a pattern like hers. Saturday morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of soft, overcast light that made the whole street look flatter, like somebody had taken all the shine off the neighborhood overnight. I was in the garage before 7 with a legal pad, a tape measure, and the old survey maps spread across my father's workbench under a clamp lamp that threw a clean white circle across the paper. The smell in there was familiar now in a way that steadied me. Dry cardboard. Machine oil. Faded wood stain. Coffee cooling too fast in a chipped black mug by my elbow. I had spent enough years looking at scenes other people thought were ordinary to know when a pattern was trying to hide inside routine. Lindsay's pattern was not random. It followed a structure. She pressed in public, documented in writing, then let neighborhood gossip do the rest. The only question left was whether she had actual authority under any of it, or whether she had been bluffing so long. Nobody around her remembered the difference. I unrolled the oldest survey first, the one my father had dated in blue ink from the year he widened the driveway. The paper crackled at the edges when I flattened it with both hands. Lot line. Utility easement. Street setback. Concrete extension. I traced each one slowly with a pencil, then laid the homeowners association notice beside it and read the line about community access expectations again. The wording was slippery. Not emergency access. Not municipal code. Expectations. It sounded official if you read fast and thought slow. I went back through the binder of governing documents Lindsay had handed me on move-in day, the same packet I had tossed onto the hall table without much thought because I was still carrying boxes and grief at the same time. This time I read every page. Bylaws. Architectural review procedures. Parking guidance. Temporary storage visibility. Trash bin rules. Lawn care language. There were plenty of things in their design to make suburban life feel tidy and manageable, but one thing was missing. There was nothing giving the association control over temporary use of a private driveway for loading and unloading on an owner-occupied lot. Nothing about emergency access either, except a clause referring to fire lanes and common areas. Common areas. Not mine. I sat back on the old stool by the bench and let that settle in. The fluorescent hum of the clamp lamp seemed louder all of a sudden. Out on the street, somebody rolled a trash bin toward the curb, the wheels rattling over the seams in the sidewalk. Ordinary neighborhood sounds. Ordinary morning. But underneath it, something had shifted. Lindsay had not just overreacted. She had built her whole complaint on language that did not apply to my property in the first place. I made 2 neat columns on the legal pad. What the notice claimed. What the documents actually said. By the time I finished, the page looked less like notes and more like a cross-examination waiting for the right moment. Around 9, my phone buzzed with a message from Nora Bell. I have something you may want to see. 5 minutes later, she was standing at the side gate in gardening gloves with a small manila envelope tucked under one arm. I invited her into the garage, and she looked around at the papers spread everywhere, the survey. Maps, the letters, the screenshots, the neat lines of notes, then gave me a look that was half approval and half relief. Good, she said softly. You are taking her seriously. She handed me the envelope. Inside were photocopies of 2 old warning letters addressed to her late husband from 3 years earlier, both on the same association letterhead, both signed not by a property manager or attorney but by Lindsay herself. One was about a flag bracket mounted without prior approval. The other claimed his pickup had exceeded acceptable driveway occupancy duration while he was recovering from knee surgery and unable to move it for 2 days. I read both, then looked up at Nora. Did the board authorize these? She let out a dry little breath that might have been a laugh in another life. That depends who you ask. Lindsay always said she was acting on behalf of the board. The board always acted surprised when anyone pushed back. There it was again. That wordless gap between real authority and borrowed authority. I could feel it now, not just in the letters, but in the whole neighborhood around me. In the way people lowered their voices when they said her name. In the way vague rules had somehow become personal weapons over time. Nora pointed to the survey map on the bench and asked what I had found. I showed her the clause about common areas and the absence of any rule covering what Lindsay had claimed during the 911 call. Nora read it twice, then looked toward the street through the open garage door where Lindsay's white sport utility vehicle was parked 2 houses down in front of someone else's lawn, as if it had every right to be there. So she lied, Nora said quietly. I kept my eyes on the documents a second longer before answering. Not exactly, I said. She did something worse. She used words she knew would sound true to people who would never stop and check. That was the moment it stopped being about an annoying neighbor and became something cleaner in my head. Lindsay was not enforcing a standard. She was manufacturing compliance through borrowed language, staged urgency, and the confidence that no one around her had the time or patience to pull the file and read the fine print. I did. And as the gray morning light shifted brighter across the driveway my father had once widened with his own hands, I realized I was no longer waiting for Lindsay Harlow to make another mistake. I was starting to understand the exact shape of the one she had already made. By Saturday afternoon, my garage no longer looked like a place where a man unpacked boxes. It looked like a place where a case was being built. The workbench was covered edge to edge with paper in neat lines and small weighted stacks. My father's old steel ruler pinning down the survey map on one side, the association notices arranged by date on the other, screenshots from the neighborhood message board clipped together in the middle, and my yellow legal pad sitting at the center of it all like a spine. The air had gone warm and still. Somewhere down the block a sprinkler clicked in slow, patient bursts. Every few seconds the water hit the sidewalk with that soft ticking sound that always reminded me of time passing in suburbia, quiet and steady and easy to ignore until it had soaked everything around it. I sat on the stool with my forearms resting on my knees and looked at the pattern one more time. The more I studied it, the less emotional it became. That was always the shift that mattered. Once irritation cooled into structure, you could work with it. Lindsay had made 3 mistakes already. First, she had claimed emergency access on a private driveway when the governing documents only addressed common fire lanes. Second, she had entered my property to photograph a supposed violation. Third, she had created an association paper trail using language broad enough to sound official and vague enough to avoid direct scrutiny. That combination told me something important. She had been doing this long enough to trust the performance more than the facts. So I stopped asking whether she was overstepping and started asking how often she had done it before. I pulled my laptop onto the workbench and began making requests. Not dramatic ones. Just the kind that matter later. I exported my doorbell footage from the morning of the 911 call, then saved the clips from the shelf installation, the mailbox stake, and Lindsay stepping onto the driveway to take photographs. I labeled every file with date and time down to the minute. Then I submitted an online records request for the incident number tied to the call that had brought patrol units to my house. Not because I needed the answer right away. Because people like Lindsay counted on the fact that most people never bothered to ask for the paperwork behind the moment that embarrassed them. I had learned years ago that memory is useful, but records are merciless. After that, I sat back and opened the packet of neighborhood documents again, this time not to read, but to compare signatures, formatting, and authority lines. Some notices came from the management company. Some came from the board as a whole. The ones Lindsay sent carried her name in a bold script font beneath a title that was slightly larger than anyone else's. President, Community Standards Committee. That looked impressive until I searched the bylaws and found no committee by that exact name anywhere in the packet. I read the section twice, just to be sure. Architectural Review Committee, yes. Finance Committee, yes. Community Standards Committee, no. I stared at her title on the notice and felt that same cool settling in my chest I had felt when I realized she was standing over my property line in the photo. Borrowed language. Borrowed authority. Borrowed fear. She had dressed herself in procedure the same way she dressed herself in that perfume and those polished little speeches, banking on the idea that nobody would slow down long enough to notice the stitching did not match. My phone buzzed just after 4. It was Nora again. She did not call often, so I picked up immediately. You should know, she said, her voice low and careful. Lindsay is telling people the officers gave you a warning and that the association is monitoring the property now. I closed my eyes for a second and listened to the sprinkler ticking outside. There it was. Public pressure layered on top of private notices, exactly on schedule. Did she say that directly? I asked. To the Carters, yes, Nora said. And probably to half the street by dinner. I thanked her, wrote it down, and added a new heading to the legal pad. Statements made to neighbors after official response. Then I underlined it once. Most people think the dangerous part of someone like Lindsay is the call, or the letter, or the confrontation at the curb. It is not. The dangerous part is what comes after, when they start laundering their version of events through other people until rumor hardens into accepted fact. That was the real mechanism. Not a badge. Not a bylaw. Social pressure wearing official clothes. The sun had shifted by then, angling low through the open garage and laying long gold bars across the driveway. Dust floated through the light over the workbench. My father used to say you could tell what kind of man you were dealing with by how he treated a boundary line when he thought nobody was watching. Fence line, property line, line in a contract, line in a conversation. Lindsay crossed all of them the same way, lightly and often, counting on charm when she could and pressure when she could not. I looked around the garage at the boxes I still had not unpacked, at the old radio, at the survey maps, at the notices with her name on them, and I understood something with complete clarity. This was no longer about defending my driveway. It was about letting Lindsay keep reaching until she finally touched a line she could not talk her way back across. And by the time the evening heat settled over the street and the first porch lights blinked on one by one, I had finished organizing every page, every clip, and every lie she had handed me so far. All I needed now was for her to believe she was still winning. By Sunday morning, the street had settled into that polished suburban calm Lindsay seemed to worship: trimmed hedges, clean driveways, church clothes, coffee cups moving from front porches to parked sport utility vehicles, the whole neighborhood acting like rules were sunlight, and she had invented dawn. I was in the garage again before most people had finished breakfast, standing over my workbench with the files spread in precise stacks, when my phone buzzed with a name I had not seen in a while. Ramon Vega. I looked at it for a second before answering, already knowing from the timing that word had traveled farther than Lindsay intended. Ramon did not waste time with small talk. I heard you had patrol at your house over a driveway, he said, and even through the phone I could hear the dry edge in his voice that meant he already suspected the answer. That is one way to describe it, I said. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Ramon had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the difference between a real disturbance and a person trying to borrow emergency response for neighborhood theater. We had worked together for years before I moved into administration, and he was one of the few people I trusted to hear half a story and still understand the whole shape of it. I told him the facts, clean and simple. Private driveway, false emergency framing, repeated association notices, possible trespass, rumors spreading after official response. He listened without interrupting, which was exactly why I called him back after the first conversation ended. 10 minutes later, he was standing in my garage in a plain gray polo and jeans, coffee in one hand, reading Lindsay's notices with the kind of expression mechanics get when someone brings in a car after 3 other people have already lied about the sound it is making. He set his cup down by the workbench and tapped the line about community access expectations. That is cute, he said. Vague enough to scare people. Useless if somebody actually reads it. I slid the survey map toward him and pointed out the common area language, the lack of authority over temporary driveway use, the photo showing Lindsay standing inside my property line. Ramon nodded once slow. She has done this before, he said. It was not a question. Nora says she has, I answered. And I believe her. Ramon looked toward the open garage door, out at the driveway where the morning light was starting to burn off the last of the cool air. You are building the right file, he said. Now you need 2 things. Records and outside eyes. Outside eyes. That was how professionals talked when they meant witnesses, corroboration, documentation that did not depend on your own voice alone. A few minutes later, he made one call from my driveway and another from the curb, pacing slowly, keeping his tone easy. By noon, the first outside eye arrived in the form of Claire Donahue, a municipal attorney with dark tortoiseshell glasses, a navy legal pad, and the kind of composed silence that makes loud people nervous before she has even spoken. She parked neatly, stepped into the garage, and took in the scene in one sweep. Survey maps, notices, screenshots, video, timestamps, my legal pad. She did not praise it. She just nodded as if she had expected nothing less. Walk me through the sequence, she said. So I did. The move in, the first contact, the notes, the photographs, the contractor, the 911 call, the rumors afterward. Claire wrote almost nothing down during the first 10 minutes. She mostly watched me, not suspiciously, carefully, looking for exaggeration, maybe, or emotional distortion. She found neither, because by then I was not telling a grievance. I was laying out chronology. When I finished, she took the association notices and lined them up by date. This is pressure architecture, she said, not governance. I liked that phrase immediately because it was true. Lindsay was not managing a community. She was building a structure around people until they felt smaller inside it. Claire pointed to the signature line on the latest warning. And this title is interesting. I told her I had already checked the bylaws and found no formal committee matching what Lindsay claimed to chair. Claire gave the faintest smile. Good, she said. That means she either invented authority or stretched delegated authority past recognition. Neither plays well once scrutiny begins. Ramon leaned against the workbench, arms folded, reading the screenshots from the message board. What about the rumor that patrol warned him? He asked. Claire looked at me. Did they? No, I said. They called it a neighborhood dispute and left. Claire tapped her pen against the paper once. Then every version of that story she repeats after the fact matters. That was when the whole thing sharpened into something almost elegant. Nora brought history. Ramon brought perspective. Claire brought structure. None of them were loud. None of them needed to be. They each saw Lindsay the same way from different angles. Not as a difficult woman, not as a nosy neighbor, but as a person who had learned how to drape personal control in procedural language and count on other people being too tired, too polite, or too intimidated to challenge it. Claire closed her folder and asked the question that shifted the air in the garage. Do you want this to stop quietly, she said, or do you want the full pattern exposed? I looked past her to my father's old radio on the shelf, to the driveway beyond it, to the neighborhood street where Lindsay's white sport utility vehicle turned slowly onto the block like she was making an inspection lap through property she thought she owned. Then I looked back at the stacks of paper she had created with her own hands and the people now standing around my workbench because she had pushed too hard for too long. I want the truth to become expensive for her, I said, and for the first time since that first patrol car rolled up to my house, I knew I was no longer standing alone on my own driveway. We put the plan together on Sunday afternoon in my garage with the door open to the street and the smell of cut grass drifting in from somewhere down the block, that sweet green suburban smell people mistake for peace. Claire stood at my father's workbench with one hand resting on the survey map and the other on her legal pad, reading back the timeline in a voice so calm it made the whole thing sound inevitable. Ramon leaned against the freezer in the corner, arms folded, watching the street through the open garage like he was not watching it at all. Nora Bell sat in the old metal chair by the side door with her purse in her lap and her gardening gloves still tucked into one pocket, looking more certain than I had seen her since the day I moved back in. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The best plans never sound dramatic when they are being built. They sound specific. You do not confront her first, Claire said. You do not warn her. You do not announce boundaries to someone who already ignores them. You let her repeat the pattern while every piece of it is documented cleanly. I nodded because that fit exactly with what my instincts had already been telling me. Lindsay did not need more emotion from me. She needed more rope from herself. Claire tapped the notice about community access expectations and drew a square around the phrase with her pen. This is where she is strongest socially and weakest legally, she said. She likes words that sound urgent. So you give her an ordinary moment she can mislabel as urgent again. Ramon looked over at me. Same setup, he said. Truck in the driveway. Temporary. Lawful. Camera coverage from every angle. I glanced out at the concrete strip my father had. Widened with his own hands. Now gold with late afternoon light. And the whole thing clicked into place so neatly it almost felt generous. Lindsay had built her own trap one complaint at a time. All we had to do now was let her step back into it with confidence. We walked the property line together after that. Claire in low heels, Nora careful at the cracks, Ramon silent and observant, me carrying the old survey copy in a plastic sleeve. We marked where the doorbell camera caught the front walk, where my garage camera covered the driveway apron, where Nora's porch had a clean view of the curb, and where Lindsay would most likely stand if she came over again to perform authority at close range. The sun was dropping by then, throwing long amber shadows across the lawns, and somewhere across the street a wind chime made a soft hollow sound that kept drifting in and out like a thought I was almost done having. Do not block the sidewalk. Do not block the street. Do not do anything even close to questionable, Claire said. Make it boring. Boring is your friend. That line stuck with me. Boring. That was the one thing Lindsay could not tolerate. She needed scenes to feed her version of the neighborhood. Little pockets of friction she could label and circulate until people forgot who created them. So the plan was not to outshout her. It was to deny her ambiguity. Monday morning, I would back my truck into the driveway and leave it there while I unloaded the last of my father's storage bins from the garage attic, a normal task, in daylight, fully on my property, for a reasonable amount of time. Nora would be on her porch with her knitting, which meant she would see everything without looking like she was seeing anything. Ramon would be nearby, but out of view, close enough to respond if needed, far enough away that his presence did not contaminate the moment. Claire would not be on site. Her job came after. Mine was to stand there, stay calm, and let Lindsay decide whether her appetite for control was stronger than her caution. Before they left, Claire closed her folder and looked straight at me. "One more thing," she said. "If responding officers arrive, you still do not lead with who you are. Not yet. Let the facts land first." I knew why she was saying it. A badge too early would change the chemistry. It would give Lindsay a way to pivot from aggression to wounded confusion, from certainty to misunderstanding. No, better to let her commit fully to the version of reality she had already been building for the whole neighborhood. Better to let her talk. Better to let her repeat the lie into cameras, witnesses, and official response. When the garage finally emptied and the evening settled over the block, I stood alone in the doorway listening to sprinklers hiss and porch doors close and distant television noise leaking from somebody's open window. The street looked so ordinary it was almost insulting. Clean curbs, quiet lawns, trimmed hedges, a place where everyone pretended order happened naturally. But I knew better now. Order was not what Lindsay had built here. Fear was. And as I looked at my truck parked exactly where it had every right to be, I realized Monday was not going to be the day I challenged Lindsay Harlow. Monday was going to be the day I gave her one last chance to expose herself without realizing the whole neighborhood was finally starting to watch. Monday arrived bright and hard, the kind of clear blue morning that made every roofline look sharper and every parked car look freshly judged. By 7:15 my truck was backed into the driveway exactly as planned, fully on my property, tailgate down, 3 storage bins lined up beside the garage opening, and a folding ladder set under the attic hatch, where I had spent the first hour bringing down boxes of my father's old records, camping gear, and yellowed manuals. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was the point. The air smelled like warm concrete, cut grass, and the dark roast coffee cooling on the workbench behind me. Nora Bell was on her porch in a pale blue cardigan with knitting in her lap, head down just enough to look occupied. Somewhere beyond the corner, out of sight, Ramon was close. My cameras were live. My notes were ready. All I had to do was keep moving slowly and let Lindsay decide who she wanted to be. She made the decision at 7:28. I heard the quick tap of heels before I saw her, then the sharp little chirp of a vehicle. Lock. And there she was crossing the curb from her white sport utility vehicle with that same clipboard tucked under one arm and her phone already in her hand, like she had been waiting for a reason to use it all weekend. She did not greet me. She did not ask a question. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, looked at the truck, looked at the bins, looked at the ladder, and lifted her chin with the confidence of someone stepping into a script she had already rehearsed. "I warned you," she said. "You are creating an access issue again. And now you are storing materials in public view." I set down the box of old file folders I was carrying and looked at her evenly. "I am unloading attic storage in my own garage, Lindsay." She gave me a tight smile that never touched her eyes. "That is not how this will be documented." Then she raised her phone and dialed in front of me without a second of hesitation. I listened to her side of the call in the same calm silence I had practiced all weekend. She described a blocked access situation. She said the resident was non-compliant. She implied escalating behavior. She used that polished, urgent tone again, the one that turned inconvenience into emergency through sheer confidence. When she ended the call, she stepped one full pace onto my driveway and took photographs, slow and centered, her white heel crossing the property line as neatly as a signature. I did not stop her. I let the cameras watch. 2 patrol units arrived 8 minutes later. Not the same officers as before. One was a young sergeant with mirrored sunglasses and a measured walk. The other was older, broad-shouldered, and quiet in the way real experience usually is. Lindsay moved toward them before the doors were fully shut, already speaking, already framing, already building the little theater set she thought would hold. "This is the same man," she said. "He is obstructing the area again, refusing association directives, and creating a safety concern." The sergeant looked at my truck, then at the wide-open sidewalk, then at the completely clear street, then at the bins sitting 4 feet inside my garage. He said nothing at first. He just turned to me. Sir. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered in the same tone I had used the first time. I am unloading storage from my attic into my garage. My vehicle is in my private driveway. The sidewalk and roadway are clear. Lindsay let out a sharp breath. That is not the issue, she snapped. The issue is that he thinks rules do not apply to him. The older officer glanced down, noticing the exact place where her shoes were standing, half a step onto my concrete. Then his gaze shifted to the camera above my garage. Then back to me. I saw the moment he realized this was not confusion. It was pattern. Lindsay kept talking anyway, too committed to stop now. She mentioned prior warnings. She mentioned neighborhood standards. She even told the sergeant that patrol had already addressed me before and that this was now ongoing noncompliance. That was the lie that changed the temperature in the air. The sergeant looked at her. Ma'am, are you saying there was prior enforcement action? Yes, she said immediately. Absolutely. Clean. Certain. On camera. In front of witnesses. In front of officers. I let one beat of silence pass. Then I reached slowly into my back pocket, took out my wallet, opened it, and held up my badge beside my identification. The morning seemed to go still all at once. Even the sprinkler down the block felt quieter. Lindsay's mouth parted, but no sound came out. The sergeant's posture changed instantly, not into alarm, but into recognition. Professional to professional. The older officer exhaled through his nose and looked away for half a second like he had just solved the last piece of a puzzle. I kept my voice level. My name is Ethan Cole Mercer, I said. I am the police chief over this jurisdiction, and no, ma'am, there was no prior enforcement action here. But there is now an official record of repeated false reporting, trespass onto private property, and a documented pattern of misrepresenting authority. Lindsay's face lost all its color at once. The clipboard slipped lower against her side. For the first time since she had marched into my life with perfume, paper, and borrowed power, she looked exactly what she was. Not powerful, not polished, just suddenly, terribly out of room. For one suspended second nobody moved. The morning air held its breath with us. My truck sat where it had always had the right to sit. Sunlight bright on the tailgate, dust floating in the open garage behind me, and Lindsay Harlow stood on my driveway with one white heel still over the property line and her phone hanging useless in her hand. The sergeant was the first to speak. His tone did not rise. It got quieter, which was worse. Ma'am, he said, step back onto the sidewalk. Lindsay blinked at him like she had not heard correctly. Then she took one quick step backward, nearly clipping the edge of her own clipboard. I did not know, she said, and even to her own ears it sounded thin. Not because the words were false in the technical sense. She truly had not known who I was. But that was never the point. The point was what she had done while believing I was just another resident she could corner with paperwork and borrowed urgency. The older officer asked for her identification. She fumbled in her bag, fingers suddenly clumsy, sunglasses pushed halfway down her nose. All the polish was gone now. No more community tone. No more carefully managed authority. Just a woman who had spent too long talking like the rules were a costume she could wear and was now discovering somebody had checked the seams. I kept my voice even and gave the sergeant the short version of what mattered. Repeated association notices using language not supported by the bylaws. Prior photographs taken from inside my property line. Public claims to neighbors that patrol had warned me when no enforcement action had occurred. A second emergency call that morning describing a blocked access hazard where no hazard existed. As I spoke, I watched Lindsay's face change with each sentence, not from outrage anymore, but from recognition. She was finally hearing her own behavior arranged in order, stripped of perfume and neighborhood gossip, and for the first time it sounded exactly like what it had been all along. The sergeant asked whether I had documentation. Yes, I said. Time-stamped video, association letters, screenshots, property records, and witness statements. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Nora Bell rise from her porch, knitting still in her lap, and give the smallest nod. Two curtains down the block shifted. A garage door across the street paused halfway open. Suburban life has a way of pretending not to look while missing nothing. Lindsay saw it, too. That might have been the cruelest part for her, not the badge, not the officers, not even the request for her identification. It was the realization that the audience she had spent years managing was now watching her from the other side of the glass. The sergeant informed her that the incident would be documented in full and that knowingly false or misleading emergency reporting was a serious matter. He did not threaten. He did not dramatize. He just stated it the way gravity states itself. Lindsay tried once to recover. "I was acting on behalf of the association," she said, clutching at the last title she thought might still protect her. That was when the older officer asked, "Do you have written authority for emergency enforcement on private property?" She opened her mouth and closed it again. Nothing came out. Because of course she did not. Claire had been right. Lindsay was strongest socially and weakest legally. Once the question changed from tone to authority, the whole structure she had built around herself started collapsing under its own paperwork. By noon the collapse was no longer private. Claire sent a formal preservation letter to the management company demanding retention of all notices, board communications, and complaint logs tied to my address and to prior residents named by Nora. Ramon made sure the dispatch record and call audio were secured. I listened to that audio once that afternoon in my garage while the old radio sat silent on the shelf behind me. Hearing Lindsay's calm, urgent voice describe my perfectly lawful driveway as a safety problem was almost surreal. It sounded so confident, so polished, so practiced. And that was exactly why it mattered. Confidence is often the mask people trust most. By Tuesday evening, the association board had scheduled an emergency meeting. Funny word, emergency. Lindsay had used it twice on me. Now it was finally landing where it belonged. Claire attended with copies of the bylaws, the survey, the notices, the screenshots, and a transcript of the dispatch call. I did not need to say much. The documents spoke with a steadier voice than anger ever could. The board members looked pale under the fluorescent lights of the clubhouse as Claire walked them through the gap between actual authority and the performance Lindsay had been staging in their name. One of them asked whether the management company had approved her committee title. They had not. Another asked whether residents had previously complained about selective enforcement. Nora answered that one. Quietly. Clearly. More neighbors spoke after that than Lindsay had probably thought capable. Once fear breaks in a place like that, it does not shatter all at once. It peels away in layers. By the end of the night, the same woman who had strutted up my driveway with a clipboard and a false emergency was sitting rigid in a folding chair, while people she had spent years intimidating described her pattern back to her in plain English. Not louder than her, just truer. And sitting there in the back of that room, with the smell of burnt coffee and copier paper in the air, I realized the real punishment had already begun. Lindsay was being forced to hear herself without the costume on. By the end of that week, the neighborhood sounded different. Not louder, cleaner. The kind of clean that only comes after a noise you have learned to live with finally stops. No more sharp heel clicks cutting across my driveway at 7 in the morning. No more envelopes slid under my mat with bold type and false urgency. No more white sport utility vehicle creeping past my house like it was patrolling conquered territory. The board suspended Lindsay from any association role pending formal review, then quietly accepted her resignation before the next meeting even started. The management company sent out one of those carefully worded community emails full of neutral language and corporate phrasing about process clarification, resident communication standards, and revised enforcement protocols, but everybody on the street knew what it really meant. The spell had broken. People who had spent years lowering their voices when they said her name were suddenly speaking in full sentences. Nora Bell brought me a lemon loaf on Thursday afternoon and stood in my garage smiling at the shelves Oscar had finally finished. "It feels lighter over here," she said, and I knew she was not talking about storage bins. The Carters from 2 houses down introduced themselves properly for the first time and apologized for believing the rumor about patrol warning me. An older man at the corner house I had only seen from a distance raised his coffee cup when I checked the mail and said, "About time somebody read the fine print." That made me laugh harder than I expected. Claire sent me copies of the follow-up letters she had pushed through by the end of the week. One required the association to retract the prior compliance notices issued against my property. Another demanded preservation of all records tied to Lindsay's unauthorized enforcement actions in case additional residents decided to pursue their own claims. Ramon texted me one line after reviewing the final incident packet. "Clean file. Strong pattern." He understood that those 4 words meant more to me than any dramatic victory speech ever could. Because that was the thing Lindsay never understood. I did not need a scene. I needed a record. She had spent years building power out of implication, posture, and other people's reluctance. Once all of that got translated into actual documents, timestamps, and direct questions, there was almost nothing left of it. On Saturday morning, the first truly quiet Saturday since I moved back, I opened the garage before sunrise and stood there with a mug of black coffee warming my hands while the pale early light spread slowly across the driveway. The concrete looked almost silver before the sun touched it. My father's old radio sat on the shelf by the workbench, and for the first time in weeks I reached over and turned it on. Static cracked through the speaker. Then an old country song bled into the room, thin and scratchy and perfect. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. The shelves were organized now. The storage bins were labeled. The workbench was clear except for the brass lamp, the steel ruler, and one neatly stacked folder containing every notice, screenshot, call log, and photograph Lindsay had handed me through her own arrogance. I slid that folder into the bottom drawer, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I no longer needed it in front of me to feel ready. Outside, the street was waking up slowly. Sprinklers hissed to life. A garage door rumbled open somewhere down the block. Somebody walked a dog past the house and did not glance at my driveway twice. That ordinary little indifference felt like a gift. I stepped out onto the concrete and looked down at the faint seam where my father had widened the drive all those years ago. I could still remember him kneeling there in work gloves, smoothing the edge, telling me that people reveal themselves fastest around boundaries. He was right. Lindsay had revealed everything the first day she crossed mine. She just never imagined someone would let her keep going long enough to make the lesson permanent. I never saw her come onto my property again. I heard she was planning to sell by the end of summer. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just another neighborhood story trying on new clothes. Either way, it did not matter much to me. My peace did not depend on her next move anymore. It sat right there in front of me every morning, in the stillness of that driveway, in the clean line of the garage shelves, in the smell of cedar and coffee, and old machine oil warming in the air. She had called the police to take control of my property, my routine, and my name. Instead, she documented her own pattern, exposed her borrowed authority, and handed me every piece I needed to end it without raising my voice. That is the part people always get wrong about justice. They think it arrives like thunder. It does not. Sometimes it arrives like a man standing quietly in his own driveway, coffee in hand, while the neighborhood finally learns the difference between power and permission.